What I'm going to do is I'm going to click over here to where you can see up at the menu, you can search, but I want to show you all something that we just set up recently. We've realized that we've literally had dozens of authors like Bradley, who you're going to meet in a moment, who have been on our live and interactive discussions. And so we have sort of created a page that features who we are calling the positive aging authors. And so as you can see, we've got tons of these authors here. And this is our author today who we're going to meet in a moment, Bradley Schurman. And you can learn a little bit more about him. You can click over to his website. You can see his social media connections. But most important, you can very easily click on his book and order it if it's something that's of interest to you. And and then later today, you'll be able to access this recording from that link on the Positive Aging Authors page. So anyways, I'm real excited. Let me stop sharing my screen here and welcome Bradley to the stage. And let's get this discussion going. Well, first off, welcome, Bradley. Since I met you and we chatted, I've been so charged up to have this conversation because I think our first conversation we talked for about an hour.
We did at least for an hour, and I am equally charged up because if you remember, Steve, when I was first getting into aging and longevity, I read about you and I read about the work that you were doing. So when we connected, I just thought, wow, this is serendipitous and really a dream because you were well ahead of the world in the work you were doing and continue to do today.
Oh, thanks a lot. Well, so Bradley, we're going to dive into your book and some real thought-provoking conversation here in a moment. But before we do that, let's let everybody get to know you a little bit better. Tell us a little bit about your background and what led to you writing this book.
I think, Steve, like most people who are in aging and longevity, I got into this because of personal reasons. My grandparents had entered long-term care in Western Pennsylvania at a facility called Longwood at Oakmont, which is a CCRC, a continuing care retirement community. My grandfather was born into poverty in the coal fields of Western Pennsylvania. He was in the mines at 14. Went to war like most of the young men at that time, came out, got a classic middle class job working for Westinghouse. My grandmother was an elementary school teacher. And because of their diligent savings, public programs, private pensions, they were able to retire in comfort, really in a upper class community, which I thought was really just amazing and a real neat trick of our system. But as I would travel between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., where I was at school at that time at American University, I would notice something very strange on that trip. And that is that the populations in central Pennsylvania were very old, mostly white, appeared to be lower income, lower educated, and working in jobs that were tough, cleaning toilets, pumping gas, waiting tables. And these people that were working in these jobs were my grandparents' age. And I thought, this doesn't seem right. And it really became a focus for me, leaning into not only long-term care where I started, but also really peeling back what demographic change means for us as a society. So I started at leading age. I graduated from there to AARP, and I left AARP just a few years ago to launch the Super Age and write the Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny, which was published by HarperCollins this year.
Great. Oh, this is awesome. Okay, so we're going to dive into some of the topics that you cover in the book. In the
Right.
book, I've got the table of contents right here. It's broken into three parts: the history of age, the demographic dystopia, and the new demographic order. But I know we're going to go off on a lot of tangents, and I want to remind our audience to ask questions. But tell us a little bit about how you kind of put those three parts together, the who, what, and why?
Well, I think the first thing for everyone to recognize when they buy the book and they pick it up to read it for the first time is that this is not a book about aging. This is not a book about old people. They are one component to our modern reality because there's always been old people on this planet. In fact, if you look at the linguistic history of our people, the earliest words were young and old. They date back over 15,000 years. And that's pretty amazing. Early on, we were thinking how to categorize people based on their age. But it really wasn't until the Greco-Roman period that a lot of those foundational biases started to take hold. Greeks in particular thought of young people as the ideal, people who were fit, without wrinkles. They tended to shun those people that were older, push them to the side, unless, of course, you were male, you had money, or you were highly educated. And then you were welcomed into society for the duration of your life. What's happened over the course, really starting since the mid 1700s, is that our birth rates have been in decline. Obviously, there are little bumps here and there, but the long-term trend has been declining birth rates. At the same time, at the opposite axis, we've seen increases in longevity. So our increases in longevity basically have doubled over a 100-year period. So, and at the same time, our birth rates have halved during that 100-year period. So what that caused is a really weird thing to happen where the global population exploded, people lived longer, and now we're finally at the tail end of that where we're starting to realize what these adjustments all mean. And it means that we have a lot of old people now, 70 million plus boomers, plus the silent generation, who are still with us, and very small younger generations. Generation Z is smaller than the millennials, for example, and Generation Alpha is on track to be even smaller than them. So for those of you who are joining today, this is really something to pay close attention to, because it shows that those days of cheap labor in communities are gone. The days of cheap labor are gone, period. We're entering a period where labor will become very expensive. And in fact, it's one of those drivers for inflation today. The second section really focuses on dystopia and what happens when we don't do what we need to do to adjust to the new normal. And some of the things that we need to do to adjust to the new normal are tackle ageism head on, encourage people to work longer, not just because we need more tax-paying citizens, we do, by the way, but we want people to be healthier too. And there's enough evidence that shows that people who engage in work for longer periods of time remain physically, mentally, cognitive fit for longer periods, and they live longer. So there's that added bonus too. The utopia really looks at what if we took this opportunity to reimagine what the future could be. And for those of us that are on this conversation today who are actively working right now, we have a really unique opportunity to vision the future that we want. And that future may, in some cases, look like the past. There's already plenty of evidence that suggests that people are moving now away from the big cities and back into smaller ones across the country. There's already a great amount of evidence that suggests that people are living in intergenerational housing at the highest rates in any of our lifetimes, mind you. In fact, the Washington Post just reported this past week that a majority, or at least a third of Gen Z, those are the 18 to 25-year-old Gen Zs, are choosing to stay at home. They're not leaving. And in fact, of the 18 to 29s, during the pandemic, more than half of them lived at home with their parents. So this is going to change a lot of the dynamics, especially around caregiving, which I think is an important issue for everyone on the call today, because it will directly impact your business. We're going to see family caregivers taking up more and more of the burden of care in the future. We're also going to see great opportunity to reinvent caregiving, or at least think about it differently when we can augment it with technologies. But more than anything else, if we are to get through this period of rapid and disruptive demographic change, it's going to have to be an all hands on deck approach. This is really our collective future that we're bargaining with right now. And I can't stress this enough. Our demographic reality does not change in the positive in terms of growth for the next 20 years, at least. It actually gets a lot more difficult to manage because there's going to be more people in need of care and fewer people that might be able to care for them.
Yeah, no, and we're really I mean, those of us in this business have seen this, but this recent shift, I like that you brought up the cost of care,
Yeah.
because we're all really feeling it and seeing it now firsthand on how challenging this is. And you know, that actually goes hand in hand with the other thing is, so those families that are shocked at how expensive the care is, one of their solutions is, well, we're just going to take care of mom ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, it's the old community babysitter mentality.
Yeah, and this is the way we basically have taken care of older people for the vast majority of human history, human civilization, is that families have done the work. It was really only in the past 100 years or so, maybe starting post Civil Wars, when we started to see the first real care homes come online. But really, caregiving has been the provenance of the family. The difference now is that women work, women have jobs. Women are in offices, on factory floors, you know, packing for Amazon, delivering packages for UPS. So we have included women in our workforce to such a degree now that having them exit is a threat to our economy. Returning to those traditional caregiving roles is also a real threat to women's liberation, quite frankly. And in fact, a lot of the traditional ways of living could erode things like women's rights, gay rights, et cetera, because people will be potentially forced into those traditional gendered roles once again.
Yeah. Well, you know, the referencing that Washington Post article that talked about intergenerational living, and a lot of what was brought up in that article is, you know, it's connecting college kids and older adults and getting creative, like you said, you know, utilizing technology and thinking differently about what this transition that we're going through to potentially keep costs down. Because the thing is, folks that have assets and have wealth, everything is available to them.
Yes.
Know,
They're buying family.
yeah,
They're buying things that a familial unit will do in kind. They're able to purchase.
yeah,
So the nuclear family of the 1950s, the 1960s, even up into the 1980s and 90s, the nuclear family used to be something that we all aspired to. That was a signal of success. That was a signal that you had made it to the middle class. Well, the middle class and the economics of this country don't work that way anymore. So if you're able to afford to live in a nuclear family, that means you are wealthy. That means that you are the 1% or maybe the 5 or the 10% of the total country. Everyone else is you know, patchworking it together, either through in-kind family work as caregivers, oftentimes using third-party providers to supplement. And that could be anything from Uber to Instacart to Washio. All of these different apps are being kind of quilted together, if you will, to make the burden of care a little bit lighter.
Yeah, no, this is it's very interesting. Another sort of thing that you put on my radar on, you shared an article on your social media about Pottery Barn launching a line of I think they're calling it accessible furniture, for lack of a better term, but furniture that is more accommodating to people with I don't want with disability with certain disabilities.
Yeah,
But but what you know, those of us who have been advocates for safe and accessible homes and universal design, we have been beating the drum for years on why can't this get the attention of the Home Depots and
right.
the furniture companies? And here it's happening now. It's sort of like we're seeing large businesses
Mhm.
starting to focus on this older adult people with disability market. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, in writing the book, and I've, as you know, I've been in long-term care and aging for a long time, so I'm aware of the same challenges of getting business to pay attention. But I'm more of a pragmatist, I think, at the end of the day, than most people. And I know that business doesn't move unless business can make money. And business isn't going to move until they see that there's enough opportunity, either in the way they're perceived as a company or the way their actual balance sheet looks, to make change. So most businesses have, for example, all but ignored environmental change until the past couple years, because environmental change is now a direct threat to their business. The same goes for aging. The same goes for older populations. And what we know about this cohort of boomers, and really the early or the late silent generation, is that they are refusing to live like previous generations did. And what the pandemic did is it really shot some adrenaline into change that was already happening. And I think that a lot of us who are lucky enough to own our own homes said, what do I do with this space? What do I do with this space to meet my needs? Because some people just sleep in their homes. But now you're forced to work in your homes. It's a school, it's a caregiving center, it's all of these things. So what you start seeing, and I've seen it with this group of people that I think we're coalescing around the name now, super agers. Although in my book, I call them the middle plus, but the super agers, this group of individuals that are higher income, very focused on well-being, typically engaged in work, and not at all interested in leaving their homes, are saying, not me. So they're demanding products and services now. They're starting to think about how they can make those modifications to their homes themselves. And that can be the light stuff, the grab bar, the better flooring, the better lighting. But they don't have a lot of resources for that quite yet. So what we're doing at the Super Age now, and we hope to launch in the next, formally launch in the next couple months, is a certification program called Super Age Inclusive Design, also known as SED. And within SED, we're focusing on the built environment, primarily space. And we want to make sure that individual homeowners have the tools they need to modify their bathrooms, make sure their kitchens are right, fitted for them, even their outdoor spaces work. Because in this new age, the home is the final frontier. The home is the office, it is the school, it is the care center. And people will continue to push away from going into a hospital or into a nursing home going forward.
Okay, and great. And I posted in chat there the superage.com. That's where you can get everything related to what Bradley's talking about today. In addition, it's really easy to click over and grab a copy of the book and dive a little bit deeper into some of these topics. But well, so you brought up ageism earlier, which is something that I really feel people don't realize what a speed bump that is to the types of services that many of us offer to support and help older adults and their loved ones. And one of the things that I like about the Pottery Barn moving into this space, and Lowe's, and there's this Amazon purchased a large medical practice this week as well, is that it begins to it's one step in a direction to um, reduce ageism, because now, being old is cool, and it's more mainstream.
Yeah, it's normalized. And that's in large part because of scale. Again, I don't love to boil it down to business terms, but let's do it because that's what business listens to. And that's what society listens to, is that we don't move until scale changes. In the book, I talk about labor markets because I think labor markets are one of the ways that we combat ageism in our society. And few people realize that when the baby boom happened, it was an abnormal event, the baby boom, okay? This 76 million people group came out of nowhere following the war because it was this great period of prosperity and change. But prior to the baby boom, we had 20 years of pretty awful times. 2 world wars, 1 pandemic, and a Great Depression. People weren't having babies. So in that period post-war, 1946 starting line to 1964, really when the first boomer comes to work, we have a period, almost a 20-year period, where we have a tight labor market, one of the tightest in human history in our country. What happens during this period? It's the golden age for the American worker. There were 1 out of 2 men in the workforce at that time over the age of 65. Today, that number had dropped in the 1990s to almost 1 out of 10. Wow. And today we're at 1 out of 5. And we're on that upward trajectory. But there aren't those pools of young people to go after anymore. So we have to engage older people. So older people naturally are going to show what they already have. Great skills, great expertise. They're cool. But we also had this other thing happening on the side. We had the emergence of social media. And whatever you think about social media, I think it's been a net positive at the end of the day, despite the social fraying that's come with it. Social media has been a bellwether for older people, especially older women, because they're getting on here. They're saying, we're not going through Madison Avenue anymore. We're not going through broadcast television to get online and show who we are. We're just showing up. And lo and behold, guess who's following them? Young people. Mm-hmm. Young women in particular, because these older women are showing a plausible view of the future.
Yeah.
And that's very exciting. And businesses have caught on. So even though, and there's a great study that came out just a few weeks ago from the A&E networks and they did an AI study of advertising, and they found an abysmal rate of older people being represented in television, especially in how they were represented, typically old, frail, decline. That is changing slowly but surely, because what's happening in social media is now bleeding into the streaming services. We're starting to see more realistic portrayals of people in later life, not just your absent-minded aunt or your bedridden grandpa.
I love it. I mean, it's you can see those who have been in this business for a long time can see the shift, and I think you're right. The pandemic accelerated a lot of this. It was going to happen, and it's happening, but it accelerated it. And Bradley, probably the most popular topic that we have on here, and you just touched on it, is the topic of solo aging. Okay. And, the term used to be elder orphans, but now I noticed on our discussions, people were proudly referring to themselves as solo agers. And, again, solo agers can be men and women, but predominantly the older single adults are women. And I think because they're I hope I'm not drawing a stereotype, but because they're proud and independent and taking charge, they're an inspiration for all of us.
Yeah, and I think there's almost a certain degree, without stepping outside of my lines. I think there's also a certain degree of freedom that comes with becoming invisible. And a lot of women experience that erasing from society because such a premium is placed on looks. And that when you become invisible to some degree, or you lose that position, it allows you a greater freedom to be who your true self is. And I think there's something, talking to older women who are living very authentically now, that seems to be a common thread, a common theme is, I couldn't be myself until I wasn't seen. It's an interesting thing that I'm sure that somebody a lot smarter than me will dive into and dig into. But I think if you follow, I think it's Ari Seth Cohen's blog, Advanced Style. If you haven't seen it yet, look it up. It's on Instagram. It's amazing. He was about my age. I'm turning 45 in a couple weeks. But Ari started this blog where he tracked the fashion of older women in New York City. And the outfits these ladies wear are just like over the top beautiful. But you wouldn't find women in their 20s or 30s wearing outfits quite like this because they are so special, quite frankly.
Yeah, here I just pulled it up. Let's take a peek here. It's um advanced style, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The this is cool. That's great. I dropped that into chat. As you were talking, I believe somebody told me this, the Red Hat Society,
Mm-hmm.
that many older women are members of, was born out of that. It's sort of like, I've played by the rules. I've
Yep.
done what everybody said, and I'm just going to wear these crazy, gaudy hats
Right.
and just be myself and
Yeah.
not care anymore. And there's something very empowering about that attitude that we can all aspire to.
Yeah, and I think when we break from some of the standards that society puts on us, it is liberating. Um, Although you can't ever endorse ageism, because it is just a terrible bias and it does really pull people down. But if there's anything positive to come from it, it's folks that are able to live a bit more authentically than they ever have before.
Yeah, and Jose Ramos threw in comments there. Ageism is prejudice on our own future selves,
Mhm.
and it is. If you're at a barbecue or a party and you hear somebody sort of talking about um, in using ageist language, a
Mhm.
lot of times you can just nobody. I think most people are doing it by accident because
Yep.
it's so embedded in our culture, and they don't realize how ridiculous ageist statements sound, and how,
Yeah.
if they're lucky enough to reach an advanced age, how upsetting and demoralizing it would be to hear somebody speaking that way.
100%. And just as sexism was a welcome bias at one point, and racism, homophobia, um, ageism is perhaps the most encouraged or accepted bias that we have today, perhaps in lines with transphobia. Um, that level of nastiness comes with it, and it's dangerous. We're making people sick. We're shortening their lives when we are overtly ageist towards them or towards others. We devalue the human and we devalue their experience, their lived experience.
So the one of the things that you brought up that I agree with, and I guess I never really thought about it that much, is that older people in the workplace um, is going to be a necessity now,
Mhm.
like because of the labor shortage.
Yeah.
Um, but again,
Which, mind you, Steve, let's be clear about this. We have a labor shortage in large part because of ageism.
yeah, yeah.
So
Oh,
we are in quite a conundrum right now
well,
because
that's kind of my point, is that I think we've got this culture of where, oh, I can't wait till I don't have to work anymore,
right.
or a mandated,
Yeah.
whether it be formal or informal, hey, there's nobody in this office
Yeah.
with gray hair. So, my time's almost up.
Right.
But the more older adults are in the workplace,
Mhm.
again, it's purposeful, it's meaningful, and it's helpful. And given some of the economic conditions for many of us, it's going to be a necessity. Is
Yeah.
that 401k is not going to generate the income that I need. But uh, what are some of your thoughts on?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. So the
Okay,
first,
sorry.
probably the biggest one is we are in our current situation, the Great Resignation, where 4 million people are leaving jobs every month for two reasons. Reason number one is that an excess number of older people left the workforce, a large number of them due to redundancies during the pandemic, in excess of another 1.5 million or so people. The second component, which people often miss, is that our birth rates have declined. So Gen Z is sizably smaller than the millennial generation, which is now the largest generation that we have at 72 million people. And like I said earlier, Gen Alpha is even smaller than them. So competition now is heating up for employees because we have this labor crunch, and it's forcing employers to look in non-traditional spots. They're looking up. They're looking for older talent now because that's the talent that currently exists. But make no mistake about this, retirement is a construct. It's a construct that was thrust upon us with all of the best intentions possible in the late 1800s in Germany, the early 1900s here in the United States. We industrialized it by the mid-century. We beat it into people's heads that that gold watch and that pension was going to be there for them, that they could move to a sunny locale in Florida or Arizona. And in fact, today, if you ask the average person to picture what retirement looks in their head, they're going to say to you, beach, golf course. Those are your two answers. And if they don't answer that, they go to the awful extreme, which is decline in nursing homes.
Hmm.
So there's not a lot of gradation there when talking about how people vision retirement today. So people have been sold on this deal that retirement was going to be there for them. What way too few people realize is that it's not in the way they expected, not in the way they had hoped. So typically, when you leave the workforce as an older adult, it is twice as hard to get in and you earn half as much. So what people should be really focused on, older people in general, especially in the later part of career, is illustrating that you want to be part of the workforce, showing off your curiosity and willingness to take on projects. If you start shutting down as an employee, that's starting to signal to an employer that you're done.
Mm-hmm.
There's very little incentive to keep you at that point. And I can tell you, I have friends that are in their 60s approaching that retirement age, and they fall into one of two camps. Those who are staying say, I'm making myself known at meetings, I'm showing up, I'm taking on the extra work because I want to be there. The others that aren't, they shut off years ago.
Yeah.
They're just, and I have one close friend who literally every time I speak to her says, it's just another 2 years, 2 months, and 1 day. Like she is literally counting down till the end.
And that's and I love how you frame this, because the employer knows that, like,
Yes.
is you're not discuss if she's telling you um she's telling a lot of people that, and the employer is sort of like, well, I Sally will be here and she's just going to mail it in,
Mhm.
but very good point. But and again, this is sort of it's a cultural muscle that we need to exercise differently, I guess.
Yeah, and you're starting to see the emergence of individuals who are putting out into the marketplace of ideas this concept of transition, because stopping work abruptly, it's like taking oxygen away from you. Like it's not a good idea. It's going to hurt you. Um, there are people like Michael Clinton, who's written the book Roar, Into the Second Half of Your Life Before It's Too Late. that's working on a really cool platform that looks at life transitions. But there are these types of programs and thinking that exist all around the world today about how do we work with older employees in particular to ease them into this retirement phase of life versus just dropping them in there. And that to me is something that's going to be made possible in large part because of necessity. Businesses have to figure this out if they want to stay solvent. And technology. Technology is going to be a great enabler for people to work maybe 10 to 20 hours a week versus a 40-hour plus week. But businesses really at the end of the day need to think about recruitment and retention differently. They need to turn it around. It needs to be about retention and recruitment. Individuals, older individuals, need to know that they're valued too, so training programs really need to be directed at all people. And frankly, some of the most innovative work that I've seen has been done at small scale. Businesses really playing that role of partner in life, which is what they used to do. Businesses playing that role of partner in life and having frank conversations with their employees about the retirement readiness. Do you have enough money put aside? Are you mentally prepared for this? How do you vision what your future looks like? Because men, quite frankly, Steve, men are terrible at this. Men are terrible at retirement. They are so bad at it. And when they drop out, they become at risk for a number of different things, but the biggest one being social isolation and loneliness. And we can't afford to have that kind of epidemic here these days.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I talk to people, mainly their adult children, who is like, Dad, it's when Dad stopped working, something changed, what have you. Jose has a few questions here. Do you see communication as a main barrier to intergenerational living? Youth in the first phase of life may not yet understand the life awaiting them in the second phase. The struggle to control the narrative becomes youth arguing for safety versus elders seeking autonomy. Very good thoughts there, Jose.
Yeah, great thoughts. Communication is the number one issue between generations that we have to figure out. And the workplace offers a great arena for us to figure some of these details out. And obviously, we can never make blanket statements about generations that are fully true, but there are some stereotypes that we should be paying attention to. There are some trends that we should be very well aware of. The first and foremost is young people today, Gen Z in particular, is highly digital. They don't leave their mobile device at any time. They're texting more often than email, and emailing more often than making phone calls, and making phone calls more often than they're actually showing up to have a conversation in person. Now, if you go to the other end of the age spectrum, those people that are still in work, it's almost the exact opposite. So businesses in particular really need to make those investments in communication, making sure that people are all on the same page. Because when you get people on the same page, when you set up either through formal or informal programs, these cross-generational collaborative teams, really amazing things happen. And they're happening in companies all around the world. For example, when my father had his stroke a few years ago, the first new car he bought was a Porsche Macan. Well, he's lucky enough to be able to buy a Porsche Macan, but when he did, I was absolutely shocked that he would buy a sports car, essentially, until I looked into Porsche's labor practices. And Porsche's Leipzig facility is an intergenerationally designed facility. The sole purpose of that factory is to extend the working lives of German factory workers. But something magical happened in that experiment of putting all these people together. All of a sudden, younger workers, both the factory workers and the engineers, started to see older workers at work. They started to see how they engaged with the product. They looked through a new set of eyes. So by having these things together, these groups together, real magic can happen, but we have to facilitate it. No great magician just shows up one day with a deck of cards and says, pick one and I'll tell you what it is. Great magicians practice over time. They work on the craft. So we want to create more magic like that. It can happen naturally, but the right environments have to be there for it to really occur.
I love it. And let's see, Martha's got her hand raised, so I'm going to allow her to talk. Sometimes that's a mistake. But while we're waiting to see if she opens her mic, Jose, so the title of your book is Super Age, and
Mhm.
I'm assuming there's some examples of super aging, but I want to address Jose's question in a little different way,
Mhm.
which says, how do we communicate with the eldest identity eroded, depressed, and unable to say what they mean? But when we think about super, like, so Ronald Reagan,
Yep.
great example of, you know, uh, an individual that has achieved a lot and lived a purposeful life, and then he had Alzheimer's and
Alzheimer's.
dementia,
Mhm.
and it's not easy for him to communicate anymore. Um, you know, is Ronald Reagan a super ager, or like what? How do we sort of define, and what do we do when life throws us a curveball and hits us with a left hook?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's really important that we start having very frank conversations about decline, because we do acquire disability over time. We shouldn't be embarrassed by these things. Um, I think because I had been in aging for so long as exclusively, I think about my life transitions differently. I was in to get a colonoscopy before the scheduled date. I had to fight with my doctor because I was too early for it. But I have a precondition in the family, so was able to get it through. But I think the more we have these conversations about what natural transitions can happen, especially relating to our health, we're going to be all better for it at the end of the day. Uh, and I think you can look at certain communities and how they deal with health crises. I think, not to draw a straight line, but the way in which the gay community is responding to monkeypox right now is nothing short of remarkable. There's a quick response, information's getting out very fast. There's conversations in the community on a regular basis. There's coordinated efforts to get vaccines, to lobby the government for it. We should have those same kind of conversations with elder populations. Don't be embarrassed about dementia when dementia or cognitive failure or cognitive malfunctioning is something that could happen later in life. And I think, put Reagan aside for a moment, knowing that he had that, we knew he had that deficiency after he left office. Take the current president, for example. He is openly mocked in the media for falling off his bike or for jumbling his words. I can't believe that I've gone through a full conversation today with you without tripping over a dozen of my words
Right.
myself. There's nothing age about that. I've fallen off a bike more times than I care to comment. But if I were a 40-something president or a 50-something president, that'd be okay. They just look past that. So we have to force others to be very careful with the way they use language too, and focus as much as we can on the positive side of getting older.
Yeah, I've been out in public when the incident on the bike occurred.
Mhm.
Um, I overheard several people saying, he's too old, he
He's
shouldn't be
too old.
riding a bike,
He's too old.
Yeah, as opposed to, like, and think about it, like what the other language that we use that again is actually ageist, but we don't realize it, is,
Mm.
oh, my dad's 87 and he still rides his bike,
Yeah,
still does it, can you
it's
believe it?
yeah. But when we hide these things, it reinforces some of the negative parts of it rather than just embracing it as part of our life course. I worked with an executive years ago who very clearly had Alzheimer's, and his team kind of circled around him and picked up on the deficiencies. We were never allowed to talk about it, but he would regularly forget my name regardless of how closely I was working with him. I knew it as clear as day, but there was no honest conversation about it with anyone on staff. So what does that say, especially to people in the aging community, about how to manage this type of change, or how to talk about this type of change in a positive way. Cancer is a great example of a conversation that's really turned around. You know, cancer used to be a pariah. Now people talk about it like a badge of honor. I
Mhm.
have this. I've survived this. I can get through it. Surviving a long life is equally, if not greater, a badge of courage, a badge of honor, rather. And there I go with my words.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, I think that that's one of the things that words matter, and now more than ever. And but it's thought provoking and it's educational, and we all learn things. But it's the willingness to have those conversations. Like for example, you bring up the LGBTQ community. I was recently, I've been to several of these, but talking about the language and preferences and how do you communicate with older adults who maybe identify LGBTQ in a community,
Yep.
and it's the willingness to maybe make a mistake and be like, okay, hey, the next time I have a conversation, I'm going to talk about that a little bit different.
Yeah, and
um,
it's okay to, we should also, it's one thing, it's okay to make a mistake, but we should allow people to have that ability to make mistakes too, and
mhm.
be willing to be corrected, or at least be open to being corrected. Like, that's the one thing about language policing right now, is that it's a bit out of control. And I think that probably gets us a little out of the lane of our conversation. But generally speaking, you know, language policing isn't a bad thing, but we shouldn't hold people to a misspeak, or a misspoken comment, or a comment said in earnest, um, not thinking it as a negative, and hold them to it as their only point of view. We can do better, but we have to be able, I think, as the question said, we have to be able to have these open conversations about language and about how we communicate, because words can really lift people up, and they can really hold people down.
Oh yeah. And speaking of which, I Jose has his hand raised, and so Jose, if your mic's open and you had something to add or share or ask.
Bradley, can you hear me?
I can.
Bradley, so I'm interested in seeing if in your book, look, everything you've said, I think we all resonate with,
Oh, good.
especially on the issues of combating ageism and stuff like that. But in my own work, what I'm seeking to find is what is the new narrative that we can invent for elderhood? Because
Mhm.
it can't be about forestalling the inevitable. You know, at some point in time,
Yeah.
elder people at the oldest of ages will become dependent.
Mhm.
And as a result of that, they become less productive and useless in our economy and our capitalist system.
Yeah.
So what I'm asking is there anything in your book that paints a new picture for
Mhm.
the eldest of the elder of the old so that we can learn once again to value and venerate them, you know, as we used to do in the mystical communities,
Yeah.
valuing them for their transcendent understanding or transitioning. Is there
Yeah.
anything in your book that talks about that?
Sadly, we have always had a very tricky relationship with getting old, and the belief structure that there was a time and a place where older people were venerated is really a false narrative against the backdrop of history. And it's troubling to see it come up in conversation on a regular basis, not because it doesn't sound like the ideal, but because it never was a reality. Um, if you had money, if you were male, and if you were highly educated, you typically had the ability to age gracefully, if we want to call it that, or age with purpose. But if you were not rich, not highly educated, um, you didn't quite have the same license. So we think about things like the Roman Senate, which was designed as a body for old men. Our Senate today, a body essentially for old men. The more things change, the more they stay exactly the same. But what I do see as an emergence of at least awareness around a new path of aging are the fact that we do have in our own democracy essentially a gerontocracy, this leadership of elders, whether it be the president at 79 or the Speaker of the House at 82. We're seeing a new path. That being said, if you make it that long, decline is mostly inevitable. Um, how do we turn that around? I don't know if we can. But I do think as a society, we need to move into a place where we take care of our old, at least at the same level as our young. I think that we do need to reposition and rethink about our social contract in a way that embraces decline, just as we embrace ascent. And I think that we can really focus, if we have the will, on retooling our education system in particular to help people better prepare for these changes. The fact that we take, the first 18 to 26 years, if we're including graduates programs into this, and really pump all of our money, our energies into that period to get people ready for adulthood, and we do nothing to prepare people for elderhood is really quite shocking to me.
So, I think your point's well taken, Bradley. I agree with that entirely, but I'm still looking and probing to see if collectively we can imagine um, a role for elderhood. Let me give you an example. If you get people planting 20 house plants in their house,
Mhm.
they eliminate their carbon footprint. And
Right.
so if we can start to imagine a role for elders that is not onerous, but that seems to give a contribution to society, we begin to carve out a expectation of what elderhood can mean for all of us. And that's a bad example, but that's just one
No,
of the
but
simple ones.
I take your point, and I don't disagree with you. In fact, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I want to make sure though that we're careful about um, positioning older people in certain roles, and that to me is kind of a dangerous path to go down. And I don't think you're necessarily suggesting this, but I want to make sure that my perspective is expressed. Putting people into, much like we have gendered roles, we don't want to have aged roles either. We don't want to be able to tell people they can't do X or Y. But I think what I hear you saying, if I'm not mistaken, is that we should have other paths to being productive that don't necessarily follow a traditional economic model.
Right. Look, another
Yeah.
example, quick one from another culture and my own upbringing. A
Mhm.
way to preserve some kind of place for elders is to, when you approach them, never say goodbye. You never
Yeah.
say goodbye to an older person.
Mhm.
Instead, you ask for their blessing. In
Yeah.
asking for their blessing and departure, you allow the elder person to attain a role in society that they alone can bestow, and they become more and more respected. So again, I'm not looking for ideas that are earth-shattering, but
Yeah.
I'm saying that the
Well,
absence of any
so
ideas is putting us where we are.
So I'd like to share one really concrete example with you. There's a community in just outside of Tokyo called Kotoen. I'm not sure if you're aware of it or not. There are a handful of these in the United States as well, but Kotoen is a community that was built in the 1960s, and it's a retirement community. It's for people that are really at the end of their life, and it was designed primarily for people who are middle and lower income. So we're not talking about something that is here just for the rich. Let me be very clear about that. At Kotoen, they have a primary school. So what happens at Kotoen is all of these older adults that really don't have the ability to participate economically anymore, and some of them are even struggling with social interactions, are surrounded by children, and they impart their wisdom, their life learnings with these children, and the children gain a greater respect for elderhood, which really, to see it in practice, is so stunningly beautiful. But there's also some real learnings there too that kids can carry with them, like the reality of death and the reality of loss.
Exactly.
And seeing how this all comes together is in fact already happening in a way that I think is measurable, and something that can be replicated quite quickly across this country.
Yeah, and Jose, I like the two examples that you brought up because if you parallel them with what we were talking about earlier with a younger adult, 18 years old, you graduate from high school and you could go to a trade school, you could go to the university, you could get a job, this, that, and the other. I think one idea is what you've presented is sort of the Swiss Army knife is that what people need at every stage in life is options and in an encouraging support role. And if we've got more options for cognitively impaired older adults, it's like, hey, we've got, here's some ideas for your mom, that can help her contribute and be purposeful. That might be a step in the right direction.
This is the kind of the cool part of this period, is that we have the opportunity to vision the future the way we want to see it. We just haven't done it before. People have been put out to pasture for too long without real purpose. So we have that moment now. But I really appreciate the question, the examples, and I hope you all do take a look into Kotoen, because it really is one of
Oh
those.
yeah, how did you how
It's Kotoen, Kotoen.
Kotoen?
Yeah, and it's really just, it's really phenomenal.
Great. Well, I just glanced at the clock, and Jose, thanks for your thoughts uh, and contributions there. That was amazing. I'm dropping in a website for Kotuin, and we'll learn more about that.
And please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you want to email me directly, it's bradley@thesuperage.com. I try to respond to all the notes that come in, but I really do appreciate being here today, Steve, and thank you for the great questions, everybody.
Yeah, this is fantastic, and this is recorded, so I'll make sure to send out your contact info. I'll post it all with the recording at proaging.com. It's a wonderful discussion, and we could definitely go another hour. So I hope that I can get you back on here, and we can dive into some of these topics in more great detail as well.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, Steve. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, everybody.